Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Comics Lair, which is sponsored by Heroes Aren't Hard to Find and the Heroes Convention. I'm your host, Nancy Northcott. Today, my guests, Michael G. Williams and Anne Brenneman, and I are discussing DC Pride and Marvel Voices Pride. Just a warning here, there will be spoilers. So if you have not read these issues in their entirety, you might want to wait and view this panel after you have. And now I'd like our guests to introduce themselves and talk a little about their involvement with comics. And Anne, why don't you start us off?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name's Anne, and I've been really involved in the space for probably about the last year and a half or so. I started the Twitter account, Anne Talks Comics, and it really kicked off from there. And I now have, a pretty large space in the community to just talk about, what we want to talk about. So it's, one of my beliefs that everyone belongs in the space, and that I hope I've made a, an area where people can feel like they can talk and enjoy this stuff. So yeah, that's basically what I do. So
Michael?
I'm Michael G. Williams. These days, I'm mostly a novelist. I write science fiction, horror, and urban fantasy, but years ago, I used to write as Clarion the Witch Boy for a blog called Pink Kryptonite, which was for queer comics fans to read about comics from queer comics fans. We would review comics. If we could, we would review queer comics. If we couldn't, then we would review whatever comics we were reading at the time and talk about them in kind of a queer context. And that's a long defunct site, but I've been a comics fan for a long time.
Okay, thank you. So as we dive into the discussion, we talked a little before we started recording and decided that the stories roughly fall into three categories in both these issues. The stories where prejudice or bigotry plays a central role in some way, those where it's involved but it's more incidental to the story, and those that are either just superhero adventure or stories about coming to terms with yourself. And so we'll start with the stories where prejudice and bigotry are central. And those would be the Gray Lady story and Walking Wounded in the Marvel Voices Pride issue, and By the Victors and Be Gay, Do Crime in the DC Pride issue. Which of those did you all think worked the best as a story?
Just speaking from a DC Pride perspective, I really liked By the Victors. I think the just as a complete story, it worked better, and it's definitely much more memorable to me than Be Gay, Do Crime was. Even though Be Gay, Do Crime was really fun, I think that By the Victors just stood out more. And I'm not sure if it's because of the way it was executed, the characters involved. We know that Be Gay, Do Crime actually introduced this new character, the drummer boy, which was really cool to see. But I just don't know. Thinking off the top of my head, the DC book, especially the stories that did deal with like hate and prejudice, they weren't like the word I'm looking for. They're not like focused on that per se. It's like they almost felt like they were side aspects of the story, and the characters really came to the forefront and shined. But sorry, I completely lost my train of thought. Yeah, if Michael wants to jump onto this one for a second, I need to refresh.
Sure. For me, for my money, By the Victors is the better of those from a story perspective. Like you said, Anne, just because it feels like more of a complete story, but also because it gives me sort of like exactly what I'm looking for in a Midnighter story, in a John Constantine story, and in a story about punching Nazis. So it gives me a queer character who is one of my faves. Midnighter is probably my like second or third favorite DC character. He was my favorite character back in the Stormwatch comics days. And so I was really happy and a little afraid when he got imported into the DC universe. And so I was really glad to see that that's still Midnighter. Like that's still the Midnighter that I remember reading in Stormwatch comics 20 years ago. You know, but also it gives us queer heroes doing heroic things where they are seeking out the bad people and stopping them. It's not a story of being victimized. It's a story of finding the people who would victimize us and stopping them. And that is a very powerful inversion of the sorts of stories that are almost always inflicted on us as queer readers that we're told are supposed to be representation. Stories where our own oppression and our own abuse are featured as the story hook are a little harder for me to accept as queer representation, because they're stories that hinge on the idea that we are victims. And By the Victors very much hinges on the idea that we are not victims, that we are the people who are going to be active, have agency, and decide our own fates, and defend the history of our own queer history, our own queer representation and culture through time. It also gives me flirty John Constantine, which I am very into. I am so into flirty John Constantine that it just kills me. I just loved it. I ate up every panel, even though he's not even in the main story. Just like the fact that he's in the beginning and the end, I just ate up every line that he had. It was so good. So I really enjoyed By the Victors. That one was my favorite of those.
Yeah, no, that was actually perfect. Thank you for coming to my rescue there. That was put so well.
Thank you. I'm happy to do so. But I will also say that the little drummer boy Pied Piper story, I really liked that, in part because it really wore its politics on its sleeve. And I think a lot of people complain when a story has a very overt political message because they want the politics to be sort of folded into something that they feel happens like more organically. I don't need that, and I don't care about that. I like it when a story reminds us that no, actually comics are super political and these issues are really important. And the reason why these institutional issues of things like an evil landlord who is trying to run all the marginalized people out of a neighborhood by jacking up their rent every couple of months has to be talked about openly, is because if we don't have those conversations openly, then nobody ever gets motivated to try to fix it. Everybody just assumes it'll get better on its own if they even know that it's happening. So the idea that politics gets folded into life and sort of subsumed by other things is what allows a lot of that sort of abuse to continue.
And I think there are definitely stories and places where like more subtle politics definitely fit, but I feel like a DC Pride special, it's perfectly okay for the politics to be out there loud and open, because that's what this whole thing's about, It's a space where everyone, we're telling these stories, we're telling these problems. So this is the space where if you're going to say something about it, just say it, because there'll be plenty of time for subtle stories later down the line, but everyone knows that this is going to be talking about, political and social issues. So I feel like it's less required for something to be subtle and restrained. So I think it fits pretty well.
100% agree. And in the Green Lantern story, when he says to Obsidian, oh, you're political, I guess that's what you call it these days, I was very off-put by that, because it was like, you're the person who had this experience. It's political. That queerness is inherently political. Just existence is political for queer people. So I don't know. That was a very off-putting line. And reading that, and then reading the Pied Piper story, I was reminded of, actually, we've got to wear the politics in our sleeves.
Well, that actually brings up a point about what goes on periodically on Twitter. I'm sure that you've both seen it. There's always somebody, seems like every 4 or 5 months, who comes out and talks about how they wish comic books were not political because they didn't used to be.
And, very much, yeah.
Yeah, my feeling when I see that is, have you ever read X-Men? X-Men in particular. But I mean, what's y'all's reaction to that kind of thing?
It's always given me the same reaction. And it's just, I don't know what you've been reading for the last, 50, 60 years, but it just happened again this week where someone posted, it's one of the famous, very, very rude YouTube profiles who posted like, I can't believe they turned Superman into an SJW in this new Kal-El Superman book, Son of Kal-El Superman book, and everyone's just like, "Are you high? Are you okay? Do you need help?" And it's just it's like that every time because it's I think it has something to do with the fact that when you're younger, I don't think you see the politics as much. It's like 'cause the world feels more black and white back then. There's the good guys and the bad guys, and you know that the heroes are on your side, and you don't really have an idea of what your side is when you're younger. But then when you grow up and your politics become more and more ingrained and you start to have different opinions on things, you still have that idea that your heroes are on your side and they always have been. And you don't look deeper into it because there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance when you start to realize that some of the things you think maybe your heroes don't think as well. And you're just like, oh, it's not me that's changed. It's the heroes that have changed. It's the writers that have changed. It's easier to accept something like that. It's easier to accept that the heroes have become more political over time rather than the fact that you've just realized that you don't share the same script anymore. That's what I've always thought. That's what it's always come off to me as, because I don't think there's any other way for people to actually look at these stories and say that they've never been political, or if they've suddenly become political, they've suddenly become like left leaning. There's something going on there that's some form of like denial, because I think that's the only way they can explain it.
Something my husband and I talk about a lot is that people who have never been marginalized, never had that experience, because it's, and for whatever reason, they have never felt marginalized, but they have gotten to live their life as a series of unchallenged assumptions. And the moment that those assumptions are challenged, that's when they think that they are being oppressed, because they've never actually been oppressed. But I think that when somebody says that, why are comics political now? That's somebody who has gotten to live their life and read comics with a bunch of unchallenged assumptions. And they have finally, once in their life, tripped over an assumption that they have had shot out from under them. And I guess that must be nice for them, But my take is that, yeah, when you say what have they been reading, my guess is they've been reading books about people who look like they do, act like they do, probably vote like they do, or at least think that they vote like they do, love like they do, exist as they do, see themselves in their own head as they do, and things like that. And when they encounter a story about somebody whose experience does not align with their own, then they think that that is a condemnation of their own experience, which is not the case. Every queer person knows that too, because we had to grow up reading nothing but stories that do not align with our own experience.
Well, and have you noticed just socially in general that there's a tendency when you like somebody, or when someone likes somebody and gets along with them socially, the assumption follows that we're in agreement about everything, which is not necessarily the case. And like when the Bendis Legion came out, there was a lot of uproar among older Legion fans because the characters were so different. They were, I don't recall that it got into gender issues yet, but they changed ethnicities, they changed appearances, they changed widely. And when you talk about stories that you don't identify with, it seems to me that changing something like the Bendis Legion so that more people can see themselves reflected in the characters is a good thing. And yet you all were reading, not identifying with what you were reading. So in all ways, not identifying in all ways. So what was it about these stories that you were reading that kept you coming back to the comics?
I have an answer that's a little bit sarcastic and a little bit not.
All right.
Villains. I have always loved villain characters because, and I especially love, and this is not a necessarily popular opinion among queer comics fans, but it's my opinion, I especially love queer-coded villains because they are characters who have said, I know what I want, and the world has told me that it is wrong, and I don't care. that the world has told me that it's wrong, I still want it and I'm still going to get it. And I like mad respect for that. I love that take. Also, frankly, Magneto was never wrong, and he is not wrong now.
Ah,
And it's like the tweet says, every decade since the Reagan administration has just proved more and more how right Magneto was. So, big love and Magneto vibes. But so villains are one of the reasons why I keep coming back. But the other reasons that I keep coming back are superheroes whose story is ultimately about being an outcast or feeling like an outcast, and yet the world rewards them because the world is not aware of the way in which they feel like an outcast. And some examples there would be Wonder Woman, who is not among her people. She's out in the larger world, and she, as far as she knows, is the only person from her people who is out in that world. And to the rest of the world, that has made her special. But I think that in a lot of ways, she feels very alone, and I think that's a very powerful kind of story that queer readers can very much identify with. That always drew me back. Also, she tends to, especially, I'm old enough that I grew up on the TV show as part of my first exposure to comics characters. And, there's an entire season where it's nothing but her fighting Nazis. And so you're told over and over again, here is this person in a time when she is marginalized for being a woman. She's expected to be the secretary for Steve, but she is actually the most powerful person around. And she's going to go after the most powerful enemy in the world at the time. And that is real bravery, real principle, and it's principle in defiance of the social circumstances that she is expected to live up to. And that is, again, something that I think queer comics readers can very much identify with.
yeah, going off that for a second, I think back to like when I started getting into comics, like really for the first time. And the first time I found, like when I was really young, I really liked Spider-Man. I was really interested in the X-Men, but it was hard for me to like get into them fully because I just wasn't clicking with them on a very deep level. I thought they were cool. I just wasn't relating to the characters very well. But then I found Aquaman from DC, and that was the moment when I really hit into comics. And it's because, going kind of what like Michael said, he was such an outcast. He was such a lonely character. And that was something that I very innately understood and related to. And just the fact that he was this person who felt like he had this responsibility to so many people, but nobody liked him, and yet he was still a good person anyway. That was something that really rang true to me, and there was something that was very inspiring to me. And it was the same, and it's just seeing how people talked about him online. Like, he wasn't a popular character in the books, and he wasn't a popular character out of the books either, because this was long before Jason Momoa came along and made people think a little differently. So it was hard being an Aquaman fan. I'm like, I don't know why I like this character so much, but I just have to. I'm like, this character's an outsider and I'm an outsider, and I feel like we're the only ones we have, so we got to stick together. And then thinking about like my other favorite character from the Marvel side, Captain Marvel, it's like another character that isn't, explicitly queer, but does have a little bit of queer coding. It's just the idea of a character who, no matter what happens to her, just keeps getting back up. And that's inspiring too. And I found that these characters that people online told me I shouldn't like, and that had all these hardships in the comics, they were the ones that I clung to. They were mine, And it took me a while for me to understand my own queer identity. And I really think those characters helped me through that and gave me that strength. So even though they weren't explicitly queer, just the same experiences and the same strength they gave me, that's what drew me to them.
I also think every queer comics reader identifies with the notion of a secret identity. I think every queer identity has at some point every person with a queer identity has experienced having a secret identity. And so in the comics, it's often framed as, I do this in order to protect my family. But we always read that knowing, in my experience, that really they're doing this to protect themselves as well. Because they've got to be able to, go to sleep at night and know that they're not going to get blown up by whoever. Right. They're doing this to protect the people they care about, et cetera, and it's very noble. But they're also doing it to protect themselves. And I think a lot of us maintain secret identities to protect ourselves and to protect ourselves from our families. And I think that that's something that we're really good at identifying with. I also think that just in general, in any medium, queer readers, queer consumers of culture are just practiced at inserting, or like reading whatever we're presented with as a story and sort of, passing it through the lens of our own experience and looking for the queer angles on it.
Mhm.
Well, that's really what we all do as readers, is we read the story and find the things in it that we can identify with.
Mhm.
And that actually kind of brings me to the editorial comments in these issues. The DC editorial comment was to the effect that DC has been featuring LGBTQIA characters for a long time. I've been reading comic books for a long time, and I started reading DC. It didn't strike me that they had been featuring these characters for a long time.
Mhm.
Do you all, did I miss something, or is that a little bit of an exaggeration?
I think it comes down to the word featuring, because these characters have existed for a long time, but they've really never been featured. There's been moments where they've been allowed to be shown, but there's been so little times that I can think of that they've been allowed to feature in like the forefront of anything. And it's because, there's really popular characters like Constantine and like Mystique that have these really deep queer aspects, and they're so visible in Marvel comic, like Mystique's so visible in Marvel and Constantine's so visible in DC, but it's so often when they're being shown like this and they're being put out there in the front that their queer identities they're not explicitly said. They remain as part of the background. And I feel like if you're going to feature a queer character, you should feature all of the character, not just them being a hero, but you should feature their full selves too, if that makes sense.
I can't remember. I can't believe I can't remember her name now. The woman who's the captain of GCPD Major Crimes, and she's Batwoman's love
Renee
interest.
Montoya? Or Renee Montoya or Maggie Sawyer?
Maggie Sawyer, thank you.
Mhm.
If I remember correctly, and this is a huge if, this is an if that we could set up a picnic lunch in the middle of, but if I have remembered correctly, Maggie Sawyer was DC's first out queer character. And she was introduced as a cop. I want to even say that she was a cop in Metropolis who got moved to Gotham. I don't remember. But she got introduced as a cop who was a lesbian as a very background character in the 80s. And I really feel like that was just DC saying like, hey, and then moving on as quickly as possible. So I don't think, I agree wholeheartedly with Anne. I think that featured is doing a lot of work there. I don't really feel like anybody featured a queer character in a big way until Marvel made a big deal out of North Star coming out.
Yeah, there was, Midnighter had a role in the Grayson series, but it was, here he is and bye, basically.
Yeah.
It wasn't a big appearance in that. And the editorial note in the Marvel Voices Pride essentially just talked about the evolution of the story about North Star coming out, Wounded Warrior. So it's hard to see, other than just it's intended to salute the LGBTQ communities. I don't see a bigger purpose for these books. Do y'all?
I wish I could. Like, I would like to think that Dreamer's inclusion in like DC Pride would lead to something eventually down the line. I would like to think that like the inclusion of the JLQ would be like a promise to like seeing how people reacted when they put that book's existence into a poll, and how people reacted like, I can't believe you're putting diversity up to a popular opinion vote. And I would like to think that they're going to lead to something, but based on previous track records, my ferret just knocked over a poster. Based on previous track records, I don't think they will. I think they're here to exist as one-offs, and that's about it. because they haven't really given me a lot of reason to believe otherwise. And I think that's something that still needs to change.
I think that I think that if any of this, well, okay, I think that in the DC book, it is, I'm glad it exists. And I welcome any opportunity to see Batwoman on the page.
Right.
I welcome any opportunity, because she's my favorite DC character. I welcome any opportunity to see like new queer characters created. And I especially welcome any opportunity to see queer comics that are about queer joy. And a lot of these are about queer joy.
Yes.
And that's really powerful. And I think that DC's book is very clearly, hey kids, why don't you watch our TV shows? Because every comic in that book is related to a DCU TV show on the CW. And so in that sense, it kind of felt like the old comics that used to come with like Atari video games, where it would be like 4 pages of really beautiful comics that were basically like, and now go play the game and buy another. Or like the little comic books that used to come with He-Man figurines that was like, why don't you buy another figurine? Here's a little comic that features a whole bunch more. And it felt a little salesy and like very in your face salesy. Whereas Marvel's book, I've always been more of a DC reader than a Marvel reader, outside of a couple of selected titles. Marvel's book felt a little more like, okay, we're actually going to talk about the queer experience in the form of a Marvel comic book and the Marvel characters that have embodied queer experiences. And maybe it's because a lot of these properties in the Marvel book are not currently being turned into adaptations, but it felt a little less like a sales pitch for a TV show or a movie. That said, several of the things in the Marvel book are properties that are being developed as TV shows or have been developed as movies. But, I don't know. I feel like they've probably made their money back on the X-Men movies. So I don't think that they need to remind us that Magneto exists as a character. Whereas I kind of felt like the Dreamer comic book was, hey, if you like comics but you've never watched our TV show, here's a character that's from a TV show that you could go watch. I loved the Dreamer comic, and I love that they took an original character from a TV show and imported her into the comic book universe to establish her there, and are promising that more will happen. And I really want more to happen. But I have learned that I cannot trust either of these companies to keep making the thing that I love. I fell in love with Batwoman as the headliner in Detective Comics when Batman was dead, 10 or 15 years ago. And then had her yanked out from under me. And then, or eventually had her brought back as a standalone title, and then had it canceled, and then had it brought back, and had it canceled, and had it brought back. And that kind of stuff, I don't know, eventually I just stopped reading because it was hard to be in the middle of a story arc and find out there just wasn't going to be more.
Yeah.
They end the Renee Montoya story in the DC book with sort of a the end question mark kind of thing, suggesting that there will be more of that story. And I would love that. Give me a story about Renee Montoya dating a city councilwoman who knows that she's Renee Montoya and a superhero. Like, give me that real big, because I wanted that out of the Batwoman and Maggie Sawyer storyline in the Batwoman comics. I would absolutely subscribe to that. I just don't have any faith that they would see it through for 30 or 40 issues.
Well, there seems to be a reluctance I have an unfair prejudice against giant corporations. So it seems to me that as corporations took over these entertainment branches, as with book publishing, it became less about, is this a really good story we should get behind even though it's not selling a lot, and more about, we need to produce corporate dividends and pay our executives handsome salaries so they can have suites with corner offices. And so it seems like anything that doesn't sell really well is just not going to get much of a shot. An example would be the Hawkman book, which was, in my opinion, one of the best books going, and it lasted 29 issues because the sales just went steadily downhill. So it seems like it would be hard when you have an issue like this like both of these, where there are a number of stories and they all spotlight different characters, how can you tell if one of those characters has breakout potential? I don't know.
That's one of the things that's been really bugging me, because people say it's like, oh, if you want this character to sell well, if you want to see more of this character, then go buy the book. Or if you want to see, like, because I've been complaining a lot recently about how few female-led characters there are at DC right now. And people are like, well, if you want to see female-led characters, go buy Wonder Woman. And it's like, they don't know why I'm buying the book. Like, if I'm buying Detective Comics because I want more Huntress, or if I'm buying Wonder Woman because I want more female characters in general, they're not going to see that as me buying that for that purpose. They're going to see me buying a Batman book because I like Batman, and they're going to see me buying a Wonder Woman book because I like Wonder Woman. And if there's like a side queer character in any story that I want, they're not going to see it as me buying it specifically for that character. They're going to see it as sales going up for like the main title character. So it's really hard to say, especially like DC Pride, like, probably the most prominent character in it is like Harley Quinn. So if they see sales going up for that, maybe we get more Harley Quinn stuff rather than a Dreamer book or a Flash book or anything like that. It's hard. The environment makes it hard to get exactly what we want, because it's not, money speaks, but it's not a clear language. So it's not great.
I feel like there was a time, and you do this now, so please correct me if I'm wrong.
Mhm.
But I feel like there was a time when they paid more attention to online buzz. And so if we reviewed a book on Pink Kryptonite, I mean, we were a tiny site, we were not like influencers or whatever, but we would occasionally hear from somebody who wrote these comics and said, somebody at the company noticed that you really liked whatever storyline or whatever character or whatever book.
Mhm.
And so thanks for talking about it. And I don't know that they have the capacity to pay attention to online buzzing.
There are definitely certain writers and artists and editors that do pay attention to stuff like that. How much that would actually affect something, I don't know. Because I remember when Future State Aquaman was coming out, and I'm like, this is the best book I've read all year, and it's only the second month of the year. I can tell you right now, this is gonna be my favorite when the year ends. And I pushed a lot of people to buy it. I know that people involved with that book definitely took notice of that. And I would like to think that partially has a reason as to why we're getting a new Jackson High mini coming up. But it's like, you don't know that. It's like, I know that they noticed, but I don't know how far up the corporate ladder that goes. And I don't know how influential buzz like that is anymore into getting something new made. So it's like, I would like to think that my voice matters and that what I say actually has an effect. As scary as that can be sometimes, yeah, I just don't know. I can't say.
Well, I think the corporate consolidation probably also makes it harder for
Yeah.
that to
Mhm.
matter. Nancy, I think there is no such thing as an unfair prejudice against large corporations. They have earned every judgment that we make on
Yep.
them.
Mhm.
But when it was, I mean, it's been a long time since this was the case, but when it was just DC Comics, then an artist or an editor seeing something, reading a letter, whatever, was probably much more meaningful than now, when it has to get passed up through 3 or 4 parent companies for it to reach the person who's actually holding the money. It's interesting to me. I don't know. It reminds me of the fact that when Archie Comics introduced the character of Kevin Keller, Archie Comics, I mean, everybody thinks of them as like a minor comic, but Archie Comics are almost always selling in the top 5 or 10 every month. Like, they're a hugely profitable enterprise, and well deserved. And they just like keep delivering quality content and have for, I don't know, lifetimes. But when they introduced Kevin Keller, they were very frank about basically like, we're introducing this character, we're going to make a big deal out of it, and if you like it, then you need to go buy his book. And it wasn't exactly like transactional in a way that stripped it of sincerity, but they were just really frank about like, we're a business, and if you like this character, then you're going to need to support him for us to keep him around. And people really did respond to that. Whereas I feel like when Marvel and DC go out of their way to try to introduce a queer character or a queer storyline, they frame it first as, this is our new commitment, our 37th new commitment to queer storytelling.
Mhm.
So don't worry, kids, he's going to stick around, she's going to stick around, this story's going to stick around, whatever. And then 6 months later, they're making me, well, it's just a business argument. They don't ever acknowledge that up front. And I think if they did, they might get more response.
Mm-hmm.
Could you, for those of us who are not familiar with Kevin Keller, could you tell us a little bit about him?
Sure. He is a character in Archie comics. He was introduced as an out queer character, the first queer character in Kevin Keller. He was introduced as a character who moves into town. And so he's the new kid in school. And right out of the gate, it's, you know, a story about him meeting the Archie gang, but also telling them like, hey, I'm a gay kid in your school, and acknowledging the possibility that that would be a risky thing, you know, even though Archie comics are sort of explicitly set in a safer world where, you know, kids are a little bit kinder to each other. I mean, they're, you know, Archie comics storylines involve plenty of like bullies and the jerk in school and whatever, but it's more kind of like, I don't know, madcap adventures in a lot of cases, and it's kind of got more of like a Happy Days feel as a comic book. And so they were kind of taking a pretty brave stance, a risky stance, by saying like, okay, we're going to acknowledge that there is hatred in this world in a big way, but we're going to do it by introducing this really charismatic kid and depicting that the Archie gang really welcomes him into the school, and he becomes one of the kids in the Archie gang, you know. Mm-hmm. And that's a really fun storyline. It also is a really powerful storyline because he ends up like coming out to his father, who is in the military and has a lot of sort of like hopes and dreams that he has imposed on Kevin, and seeing Kevin be immediately accepted by everyone allows it to be a story that acknowledges the risk of queerness, but also the joy of being accepted by one's friends and family. And so it was a really interesting storyline. And then, you know, Kevin had his own book for a while and had a bunch of like celebrity cameos in it, you know, and like there's one in which he meets George Takei, you know, a lot of like funny stuff like that. And it's a fun comic. And I think that character is also in the Riverdale TV show. He is, because they do a storyline about Grindr.
I haven't been watching Riverdale. It's a little dark for me.
Sure.
But I used to buy Betty and Veronica's Summer Fun every summer. That was like part of my summer vacation. And I've kind of gotten away from Archie, so I wasn't aware of this whole situation with Kevin Keller. But that kind of leads into the stories about coming to terms with yourself. So which of the stories that were really about coming to terms with yourself did you all like the best, besides early thaw we mentioned earlier? So Michael, you were saying that you really liked that one.
I really love that one. That's my favorite of all the Marvel stories, partly because I'm a huge Magneto fanboy, partly because it's a story about why Magneto has never been wrong. But it's a story about everything that the X-Men is about, you know, somebody who is inherently different and knows it, and knows that it's dangerous in the wider world, and has to hide part of who they are away, to the point of having to leave school, having to run away, basically. And I feel like that's a really powerful story that a lot of people can identify with for a lot of reasons. But I also feel like it is a powerfully queer story in a very explicit way. And I feel like Magneto's story, especially as they have like sort of developed Magneto's story in the movies and things like that, I feel like that story is something that queer people just can very easily and directly identify with. And the fact that Magneto says to Bobby, like, despite him throwing children at me, I don't actually want to hurt children. That was something that made my queer heart very happy. But that was also when he says to him, you know, like, it's never going to be easy to be different, and it's probably never going to be safe, but we will make a better world for ourselves. Like, that's a story of queer agency for me in a major way. But I just really love to have somebody who has seen discrimination and experienced it personally for many decades, longer than Bobby has, the way that this story is presented. To say, like, yes, this is going to be some real times of trouble in your life, and the trouble may never end. But if we, oh, hang on just a second. My husband left his Bluetooth speaker on, and so when he tried to watch something on his phone, it started playing. But that idea that like of queer generations coming together and saying like, you have had some of the same struggles that I have had, and these struggles will always exist, and we're going to get through it, and we can be friends, you know, and we can be mentors, you know, that he could be a mentor for Bobby in an important moment when Charles is not around, frankly. When self-appointed father figure is just never there, then Magneto is around to be like, yeah, we're different and it's going to be okay. That to me was very powerful.
Well, that actually contrasts with what you all were saying about the Alan Scott story, because that was really just his background on the way to deciding to come out. And it didn't really address those issues in the way that you're talking about early Thaw addressing those issues. And it seemed to me reading it, and I'd be interested in what you all thought, that a number of the stories in the Marvel book could have been any teenager coming to terms with themselves, except these teenagers happen to be gay or queer. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. I was just trying to see if there was any story that wouldn't fit that.
Well, some of them wouldn't, because some of them, like the Batwoman story,
Right.
dealt with her real sense of being different in a gender orientation sense.
That was actually the story I was going to talk a little bit about for this part, but
okay, go ahead.
Oh, well, say just in terms of stories about you coming to terms with who you are, I think this one was perfect. It was I think out of all the stories in this one, it was probably the strongest in regards of just like embracing that queer identity and talking about it. Because it's just like talking about how fitting in is hard, and it sucks because it's effort. Fitting in is work. Fitting in forces you to be someone you're not, and how it's much more freeing to, you know, just be out, but it's scary to be yourself. And I think just the combination of how the story worked and the artwork inside, which is absolutely gorgeous. It's probably the best. I want to say it's the best artwork out of any story in all of these. And it's a story that doesn't need to be strictly in this. I think it works in just about any context. I think you pull this out and you show anyone the story, and it's just so perfect on its own. And using her sister and like as like the mirror to her, I really like that. That was it's hard to find the exact words just because I look at these pages and I just start like gushing. It really hits home.
Well, just in terms of it as a story, I really liked the Alice in Wonderland device and the way when they pulled in the Mad Hatter.
Yes.
He's a Batman villain, but yet he's also a Wonderland figure. And I thought in terms of just this construction of the story, it was really cleverly done and more original in its framing than a lot of the others that were in the book. Were there any other stories that you all really felt either worked really well as stories or really spoke to you?
I complained about it earlier, but I really loved the Green Lantern story because the Green Lantern story speaks directly to the shifts in the queer experience over time and the ways the different generations of queer people have always had the same struggle and always had a different struggle from each other. That same struggle has had so many different iterations that it may not look the same, but it is ultimately against the same foes. And that sort of makes it the same struggle to begin with. I liked that it was very open in its acknowledgement of how different a time it was, you know, and his depiction of sort of his version of the Stonewall Inn, his version of the junk bar that's absolute garbage and doesn't have a liquor license and is taking as much advantage of the patrons as anybody else in their world, and acknowledging the problem that people in his experience didn't realize that what they were was political. And at the same time, recognizing that it is possible for like queer joy to arrive at any point in life, even later.
Mhm.
But I don't know, I personally, as an activist, I have sort of a reflex negative reaction to people who come out very late, partly because there is a part of me that very childishly resents that I did not have that option, and leaves me feeling like people who get to come out later got to take it easy. And that's not true. That's not an accurate judgment of their experience by any wild stretch. But it is often sort of my first reflex, you know, and it's a sign of like stuff that I still have to work through on my own self.
Mhm.
But I felt that a lot reading that book. And then reading that book, and I think so did Obsidian. And then I think reading that book made me stop and recognize, okay, I'm not getting over that reflex, but I can step back from it and recognize that's a reflex and maybe not a conscious thought. And that really surprised me. I went into this thinking, well, there isn't much that DC or Marvel have to teach me about the queer experience. And it turned out to be the case that they kind of did. And even though I complained about the content of that story earlier, that story still affected me. And it was still really gratifying to see, you know, I'm not old enough to have had that experience, but I am old enough to have remembered when there were queer bars that were literally underground because you wanted to be able to just like go down some steps and through a door and not have anybody see you going in,
Mhm.
you know, and things like that. And to see that represented and to see that sort of included as not just, hey kids, remember that we've got a TV show, but hey kids, remember that this happened and that life used to be really different. And to remind an older generation that queer kids today and just queer younger people in general are still fighting that fight, and that's still happening. There's still a struggle to be done, and that older queer people whose reflexive prejudice may be younger queer people have it so easy today is totally not the case. You know,
Mhm.
I don't know, there was a lot there that spoke to me about sort of the journey of queer activism across generations that I had not expected to see depicted as well.
It kind of evoked the Doom Patrol episode with that looked at Negative Man's history as a gay Air Force pilot and his relationship with another pilot. And I noticed that there was an interview with Matt Bomer,
Mhm.
a very short interview, like 2 questions, in the back of the book, which probably ties into what Michael was saying about, see, we have this nifty TV show, you could go and watch it. But when I read the Alan Scott story, it really reminded me of that episode of Doom Patrol, because that was set, of course, it was flashback in a much earlier era. One of the issues I had with the books, particularly the Marvel book, because I don't read as much Marvel,
Mhm.
and I'm wondering if you all read more Marvel and therefore didn't have this issue, is that I didn't immediately know who some of these characters were.
Mhm.
So I had to go to Google to find out who they were. And I'm not sure I really needed to do that to understand the story, but it added to the story for me. Did either of you find that as well?
Say for me, because I do read Marvel more. None of the characters are like unfamiliar to me. It's like I've known them in some way, shape, or form before. But I think part of that, that issue goes back to what we were talking about before about how the companies say they feature these characters when in actuality what they mean is we will make this side character gay so that we can see them every once in a while, but we don't have to focus on them. We don't have to give them their own books. We can do the tokenized representation without having to put too much work into it because they're not at the forefront. And I think it really shines in the Marvel book, like when you said that most of the characters in here are ones that you've never heard of before, and that the one of the trans characters in there has only appeared twice before and hasn't appeared in the last 30 years before this issue. And the another one of the trans characters was an original character created just for this book because their pool to pick from is very, very small and includes some pretty problematic areas, including a Hydra Queen. So it's I think it speaks a lot to that. And I think, learning more characters is always great. I love side characters. I love smaller characters because I feel like they're characters that have so much untapped potential. And, as someone who enjoys, things that I haven't read before, these different characters, I think that enriches the universe. I think that makes me, my imagination work overdrive. So I like characters like that from a perspective that I've been reading so long. But I do think that's an issue in itself, that there's no like Thor, there's no Iron Man that's like out there and gay. I think that's a point for the Marvel universe as a whole that I think they need to work on. And yeah, that's just how I saw it. I saw it more as just, we don't have a lot, so here's what we have and we'll make them work, which has ups and downs.
Mhm. I was particularly I'll be really frank and say that when I got to the end of the like retrospective Marvel thing at the very beginning with Prodigy, like sort of remembering all of queer history in the Marvel universe, I was like, it struck me as sort of like a little stinger at the end to be like, and Captain America was once nice to one of you. So, it was a little it was a little just like, okay, we get it. Here, fine. Here's your ally medal. Thank you.
I have my own problems with that intro. Oh, that has to be my least favorite story of the whole thing.
Yeah.
It was the idea it's like Prodigy didn't know that trans people existed until aliens showed up, and it's like, oh wait, oh shoot. That's like, you're telling me Prodigy doesn't know that a trans woman threw those bricks at Stonewall? No, you're joking.
Right. Yeah. Somebody whose superpower is remembering.
Yeah, he would know.
Yeah. So I really love She-Hulk. Like She-Hulk is probably my favorite Marvel character. And so I was a little disappointed that wasn't a book about She-Hulk, but then I was like, oh, but no, I'm super into this. I'm super into the idea that there is a trans person who has said, like, this is an identity that makes me feel safe.
Right.
They can go out into the world as this. And that like really spoke to me and was very powerful.
Yeah.
It bothered me that it was also a story about getting clocked.
Yeah. There was a lot of discussion about that story in particular, because I remember the writer came out and she said that her story is about She-Hulk, and she also said that her She-Hulk was trans. So just the way she phrased it made everyone think like, oh, so we're getting like a major retcon here? What's happening? And then she's like, it's not the main Jen Walters. And then everyone's like, okay, so we're getting like an Elseworld story where she's trans. I mean, that's different, but I guess. And then it turned out to be none of those things. So everyone went on kind of a roller coaster with that story, to the point where we're like, on its own, without that context behind it, it works. But for everything we were told ahead of time, it was a little disappointing from that perspective. But She-Hulk is definitely, for a lot of trans people that I've talked to, she's definitely like their character, because they definitely, everything the story talks about, they relate to that so innately, which is ironic because the things that John Byrne has said in the past, that one of his runs has been like this huge like trans pride run that everyone kind of clings to. So I think out of that context it works, but in the context it was a little iffy. It was a rough landing. So
yeah, but I'm so thrilled that they saw, hey, like, here's an opportunity for us to say, you, the reader, may see yourselves in these characters and find that a way to feel safe.
Right.
And then kind of like flush that. I don't know.
I mean, to me, ending with the Deadpool cosplayer felt like they just didn't know how else to end the story, so they came up with that.
Everyone at a con has had a good moment improved by a Deadpool cosplayer, and everybody at a con has had a good moment ruined by a Deadpool cosplayer. And that's just the way it is. And I feel like to some degree they did not realize they were participating in a very real convention experience.
Oh,
But the story with Victor Borkowski and Jonas Graymalkin, Good Judy, is really about, I'm not a physically attractive person, more than anything to do with sexual identity. And it just seemed like really it could have been any two teenagers. It just happens to be this one who looks very odd. But it seems like there are also a lot of people in fandom who, for whatever reason, don't look like they blend in with the crowd. And so to me, that story felt like it was for all the fans who feel like they're out of step, or I'm too heavy, or I don't have good hair, or I have acne, or whatever. I mean, it was a quiet little story.
Right. Yeah, and I think comics do that a lot. I think that's why a lot of queer people kind of gravitate to comics, is because they make the outcasts feel better. They make the outcasts feel safe, and it gives us a place to go where it's like, hey, you know, these people who don't look the same as everyone else, these people who aren't the same as everyone else can still be good people, and they can still do amazing things. And I think that's a facet that a lot of us relate to, and that's when we see ourselves in the story, we see the potential of us in those stories in a way that a lot of people don't always. And I think it's a good feeling. And I think this is definitely one of the stories that hits on that. And it plays into a lot of what Anol is actually going through in the main comics right now as well, because in the New Mutants, he's part of this group they don't fit in physically with other mutants, like they don't pass for humans. So they're currently like, they banded together, hopefully to see if they can get it fixed through like the resurrection process. And it's playing out really well there. So it was good to see that in this issue as well, because more so than the DC book, this one felt like it actually dealt with like characters in continuity and like what they were doing at the moment. So in context with the New Mutants run, I think that doubles its effect.
Well, that's very helpful for me because I'm not reading New Mutants.
Right.
So without that background to the story, it didn't quite have the depth that I now see it as having after you've explained that.
Right.
And I think maybe that's the result of, we can only afford so many pages at this price point. So you people are going to have to cut your stories to the bone. And if you have to leave out some backstory, well, those are the breaks, kind of thing.
And I feel like the more creative writers in it, I mean, they're all obviously very creative, but I feel like there are very creative stories that make the most out of their limited space. One of the things I loved in the She-Hulk story, Totally Invincible, was the moment where Titania says, are we doing a flashback in a flashback? And the character says, hey, listen, I've never narrated before, you know, and like talking about the fact that the structure is like really compressed. I love little meta moments like that.
Well, another story that I thought was interesting was Man of His Dreams, when Akihiro brings back this man, Carl, with whom he's had a brief encounter some years ago, and who has now died, and he stole the body so that he could go through resurrection at Krakoa. What did you all think of that particular story? It was sort of like he lived his life for his family and he was robbed. So I'm going to give him a chance to do it over. And he becomes a new hero who apparently we're going to be seeing again, Somnos. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but it's how it looks to me.
I think it really plays on the idea of what Krakoa is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a place of, where mutants can be who they are and be safe. And I think from a queer perspective, that the idea of that is really intoxicating. And I think the idea of this guy who lived his whole life unable to really be who he was and having to devote all of it to his family, getting that second chance in Krakoa really speaks for like what they're aiming for as a whole for this X-Men era. So I think it fit in that regard, but I think it was just as a whole story, it really doesn't fit without that further context of what Krakoa is all about right now and what's happening in the X books. And it just serves as like, hey, he finally gets to, be who he is, and that's nice. And it comments on the fact that not all queer people get the ability to be out and be who they are, and some people have to hide it until the day they die, and that's just the sad truth of our situations. And it's nice from like a fantasy perspective, but I'm not sure how well that message gets across.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know the storyline with Krakoa. None of that like really landed for me. I loved the fact that it's about somebody saying, like, we had a missed opportunity in the past. Can we have that back again? I think that is a very common fantasy, especially among queer. I mean, it's a common fantasy for everybody, but I think queer people especially look at their own history and say, how would life have been different if I had been braver, younger? Things like that. And so I think that it gets a really important and sort of under-discussed part of the queer experience that way. At the same time, it kind of lets everybody off the hook because the guy's family doesn't know that any of this has happened and is never going to know that any of this has happened. And I'm not saying that they have to know for his second chance to be meaningful. I just think that there's, I don't know, I kind of resent the fact that we don't actually get that opportunity. So I don't know, to some degree it starts touching on that reflex I have about like who gets to come out later and who doesn't get to come out later and things like that. And is that getting to, or is that having to, two very different things. So I'm gonna have a really interesting session with my therapist this week, I can tell. So, but it kind of clunked for me, even though there was a lot I liked about it. It kind of clunked for me at the very end where they were like, you'll see more of this character in. And I was like, oh, wow, geez, way to give me part of the story and then tell me I'm going to go buy a different book. Like that really just like clanged for me when I read it.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting to me because as you all know, in my other life, I'm a romance writer. And so it would have been really easy and really cliche to say, I'm going to bring this guy back and then we'll start over and we'll have our relationship. And
right.
Because then it would really be, I'm doing this for me. I mean, I can say I'm doing it for us, but really I'm doing it for me. And it wasn't like that. And that was what I particularly liked about the story. I sort of have some questions about deciding that somebody else would not have been happy with their choices and therefore they should have the opportunity to choose again. Kind of like the whole, it's not the same, but the whole Wonder Woman, Steve Trevor, anonymous guy's body thing. It's, this isn't along those lines, but it's, I'm making a decision for another person, even when it's well-intentioned. And that to me seemed a little bit off.
Yeah. It's one of those questions that the Krakoa era really brings up, especially with the idea of resurrections and what does death mean in a community where death is no longer an issue, where death is something more fixable than the common cold. And it's something I really liked for like X Factor to touch on more, but it just got canceled. And that was one of Marvel's most premier queer books at the moment. So that's a double painful whammy. And it's just, I feel like everything about Krakoa is a conversation for another day, because it's such an interesting thing just on its own, but just from the perspective of making a decision for someone else, it feels like the story was like purely like wish fulfillment for the people who need it, And beyond that, I'm not sure.
Well, we're actually coming up on time. So is there anything that either of you would like to say about these books, or anything else you would like to discuss about them before we wrap up?
Yeah, the stories we didn't get a chance to like really touch on yet were just the ones where it's like it's just heroes doing hero stuff. And I actually, over at the site on Comics Ground, I wrote an article kind of reviewing, talking about the Dreamer story in particular, because her story was the one I was most looking forward to. And just talking about how the fact that that her being trans isn't said out loud once. And I was initially disappointed by that. But then I realized the story that Nicole was telling here wasn't one where it's like talking about the trans experience in a way that I was experiencing it. Like I'm in the middle transitioning right now. So the way I view it is much different than like how she would view it as someone who has transitioned, is now at the, long past at the end of that, looking back. And it's the idea that trans people they're just regular people, and that transitioning phase doesn't define them forever. And that's how I viewed the story. And I appreciated that they took that approach on it, because it's so easy for them to play into like the sadness of it, or the trauma that we experience, or the hatred that we experience. But just being able to show a trans woman being a superhero and just going on a normal date afterwards, just living a normal life, that meant honestly, that meant more to me than just about any other story in these books. Just seeing a glimpse of like what life is like eventually, and just remembering that eventually this doesn't define everything about you, and that things return to like normal after you've reached this point. And that it was a story that meant a lot to me from that perspective.
The Dreamer story is one of the few that made me think I would read this comic book.
Mhm.
And partly it's because it's a story about a trans character, and never once in that story is she misgendered.
Yep.
It's a story that the entire book respects who she is and does not try to point out to the reader any way in which the reader can develop an excuse to treat her as anything other than who she is.
Exactly.
I feel like so many queer stories that go out of their way to depict the trauma or the discrimination or the marginalization of the queer identity, those speak to our experiences and are important, and B, some segment of the people reading them are going to use that as an excuse to say, okay, I don't actually have to think of these as people still. And so when I see a story that is just about queer joy, in the way that the Dreamer story is just about queer joy, and to some degree, I feel like it fails to speak to our experience, but I'm also gratified to see that it doesn't hand anybody an excuse to think of us as anything other than who we are.
Right.
I found that very gratifying. The Aqualad story, I'm not a huge Aquaman or Aqualad fan, but I really like that one, partly because it's another example of a villain who's not totally wrong. When Eclipso says that rage simmers just underneath the surface of so much queer joy, he's not wrong.
Right.
At least not about me. And so I like seeing that acknowledged, but also that moment when the line is, "You can enjoy the day you just saved." Like, that's a really powerful line. And so many of the stories, and to some degree the Green Lantern story almost dipped into this, but it pulls it out at the end. It is the idea that like a previous queer generation has fought and struggled and will never actually get to enjoy the benefits of the advances that they helped bring about. And so I feel like that's a really powerful moment for people to be reminded you can actually enjoy the world that you've improved by your actions. And so that was really telling to me. Just comparing the two books, I felt like DC has always had a structure in its world that they're sort of, that the superhero identities are almost distinct from the person behind them in a way that they can be handed down. And that's okay. It's okay for there to be generations of Green Lanterns. It's okay for there to be generations of Bat people. You know, it's okay for there to be generations of Flashes. And in a lot of those books, that's like inherently built into the story, that there are many Flashes, you know, and over time. And I feel like that's a really powerful way to talk about the the queer experience shifting over time as the world changes and we are still part of the world. And so, you know, queer activism 40 years ago, 35 years ago was around legalized discrimination and the HIV/AIDS pandemic and the ways that official bodies just ignored it at best, and in some cases encouraged it. And, you know, 20 years ago, it was about same-gender marriage. And now it's about trans rights and protecting trans people and queer people of color and respecting the fact that, like, that their experience is different and also a part of the queer experience.
Mhm.
And like seeking ways to celebrate that. And also trying to have this larger cultural conversation about recognizing that gender is a spectrum for many people instead of a binary. And that's a very different kind of struggle, but it's still a part of the same struggle. You know, and seeing the generations of queer activism and experience sort of grafted onto the DC model of generations of superheroes just really worked for me. That doesn't mean that the Marvel book didn't work for me. It just means that, like, there were more moments in the DC book where I was like, ah, yes, that is what I recognize as representation.
Yep.
All right, then. Well, I appreciate both of you joining me and having this discussion today. And if you would like to tell people what you're working on and where they can find you, Anne, would you like to start us?
Yeah, so you can find me just on Twitter at @AnnComics. I'll be there just about every day. Just always feel free to stop by, say hi. I'm also I've just launched a Patreon to kind of to help because transitioning is a little bit expensive. So if you want to stop by and see what I have there, I have a bunch of comic goodies. And I'm also working on some new short stories and some longer pieces. So if anyone would like to stop by and see what I'm working on, that's always an option. So I'd really appreciate any support. Thanks.
Michael?
You can find me at michaelgwilliamsbooks.com. You can find me on Twitter as @McManlyPants. You can also find me at www.arcanecarolinas.com because I co-host a podcast about weird stuff in the Carolinas. And you can find me in all kinds of places on the internet, but michaelgwilliamsbooks.com is a great place to start.
And you can find me at nancynorthcott.com or here on ConTinual, the convention that never ends. So I'd like to thank both Anne and Michael for being with me today and thank our sponsors, Heroes Aren't Hard to Find, and the annual Heroes Convention. You can find more information about them at www.heroesonline.com. Thanks for joining us for this panel.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And HeroesCon is awesome.